Welcome to 10th or Tuesday. My name is Michael Bolden. I'm here with Mike Meharry.
I'm here.
We're back. This is episode number 23 after quite a long absence. I've actually been in the process of moving our studios back to a home office rather than a location here in downtown LA in Skid Row, which was not a fun walk to get to on a regular basis. So here we are after, what is it, Mike? Maybe since August or so since we've done one of these?
I don't think it's been that long, has it?
I don't know.
Maybe.
Well, someone will tell us. So it's
Yes,
been
I'm
at least a
sure.
few months, but we're glad to be back. This is I have it down as the 369th day. We've just crossed one full year that the GOP has failed to repeal Obamacare, plus all kinds of other things, but I guess that's been our little signature thing to start. And I do want to talk about a few things going on. Mike, do you have any comments on the so-called government shutdown? I mean, so many people are discussing that. We might as well add a few comments before we roll into.
Well, I wish they would shut down the parts that they really need to shut down. I mean, I'm sure they're still spying on us and bombing people, and I know they're still taking my money. So I don't know. It's not doing me a whole lot of good. How about you?
No, I mean, I think the talk of shutdowns for decades has always just been to scare people into thinking that the world's going to fall apart unless the government continues to get more and more funding, which they always seem to do. But let's talk about some bill reports like we normally do at this time of year. This is full-fledged into nullification season, the time of year when state legislators are filing bills. The legislatures are in session to consider them, and I wanted to talk primarily about surveillance. Seeing Congress has not only reauthorized but expanded
Yep.
NSA spying under Patriot Act and FISA and all these things just in the last week or so. So, in response to that, what was it? Just a day after the Senate sent it over to Trump's desk for a signature, this spying expansion, they passed the Fourth Amendment Protection Act, Mike, right?
Yeah, in the Michigan House, they passed the Fourth Amendment Protection Act by a vote of 107-1. So overwhelmingly, this would effectively eliminate all state and local cooperation with any federal agency that's engaged in warrantless spying. So a very strong sweeping bill there in Michigan, and passed. We expected it to pass the House. Didn't really expect it to pass by that level.
Yeah, this is a really good example, I think, of how it really takes persistence and sometimes patience on these things. We've seen a bill filed in Michigan now. This is the second, or is it the third time that a similar bill has been filed, Mike?
I think it's the third.
Okay, well, in previous sessions or the previous attempt, it didn't even get out of committee. But
Right.
you've been working pretty closely with the sponsor, Martin Horlak. I'm not sure how to say the name.
Horlak, I believe is how you pronounce
Okay,
it.
and you've been working with him to get this bill through committee, and then once it got through committee, it was easy on the House floor, 107-1, as you pointed out.
Yeah, and this really demonstrates the importance of a good sponsor and how an effective sponsorship can really move a bill forward. He's worked really hard behind the scenes, dealing with objections before they even came up on the committee floor. So he headed off a lot of the opposition before
Hmm.
it even had a chance to develop. And I think that's a primary reason why it was able to pass through that committee and end up on the House floor. So now we've got it over in the Senate side, and it's going to be a little bit tougher road to hoe. We
Yeah,
should
the
say
Senate
here
in
in the second.
Michigan is just a crap hole, right?
Yeah, it really is. But I'm optimistic because again, the senator or the representative that sponsored the bill, he's pushing it hard. He seems committed to it. And I had a phone call the other day with a senator that's on the Justice Committee, which is probably where this bill will end up.
Right.
And she seems supportive, and she's the vice chair of that committee.
And that
So
was a connection from Dennis Marburger, right?
it was. Dennis Marburger connected us and facilitated a conference call. And so we're really optimistic that we can move this bill. And I think it's extremely important. Like you said, Congress just reauthorized FISA, and they did what they so often do. The administrative agencies, the NSA and the other agencies that are spying, they interpret the law in certain ways, and they expand the laws through their interpretation. Well, what happened is Congress just reauthorized it, and they actually codified a lot of those expansions into law. So they're taking these broad readings and actually solidifying so that's now the law of the land. So the federal government now has more opportunities to spy on us warrantlessly using what's supposed to be only for foreign surveillance. And so it's just imperative that states begin to take action and limit their cooperation with this type of spying. And some people say, well, this isn't going to do any good. Who cares? No, absolutely important, because as with everything else, we know for a fact that state and local law enforcement are heavily involved when it comes to the surveillance state. So if we can cut it off at the state and local level, it will certainly hinder it at the federal level.
That's interesting that some people say, oh, this won't do any good, because, Mike, as you know, a year or two ago, our good buddy Ian Millhiser over at Think Progress, the rabid nationalist or central power lover over at thinkprogress.org, was really concerned that the left was really catching on to this Fourth Amendment Protection Act idea, because he was concerned that it would work so well that conservatives would start putting into practice on other things. So we know this type of thing works. One other thing we absolutely do know is that relying on Congress to stop spying that's been authorized by Congress in the past and expanded by federal agencies is a 100% failed strategy. And in fact, I would make the argument, Mike, that waiting on Congress to do this has made things worse, because now, instead of actually building up the foundation that was necessary, so many organizations and individuals who've been pushing to get Congress to do the right thing have spent all the last 3-4 years working on this, and now things are worse.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Senator Frank Church warned us in 1975, was it, that the NSA had the potential to create total tyranny? And here we are 40 plus years later, and it's just gotten worse and worse. Congress has had opportunity after opportunity after opportunity, and every single time they've not only failed to limit surveillance, they've expanded it, just like they did this time around. And you're absolutely right. All of these organizations are using all of these resources, repeating the same failed strategy. And we know for a fact that state action works. We know for a fact that the federal government depends on state and local help for all of these things, including surveillance. And we really need to focus the resources there, because as we saw with the 107-1 vote, we can actually get some real movement in these state legislatures.
Yeah, Mike, in the show notes, I did a blog that basically said the vote is in. You can't count on Congress to limit federal spying. But I linked to a video that we had released a while back that you led the way on writing the script for, about how Nevada has successfully, and even got the backing of federal courts on this, turned off water to a federal agency. So maybe link to that. We can discuss that a little bit more if these things continue to move forward. But for now, I want to talk about a bill in your state that also is dealing with surveillance, not necessarily with NSA surveillance, but local surveillance that's fed upstream to Washington, D.C. using drones, local police. A bill just moved forward there in Kentucky, right, Mike?
Indeed. This is another example of how persistence paid off. The sponsor of this bill, Senator or Representative St. Onge, she's introduced this bill. This may be the fourth year that she's introduced this. And finally, last year it passed the House. This year it's passed the House. And the good news is it's passed the House much earlier. Last year it ran out of time in the Senate. And so this year we've got plenty of time.
Did she get a co-sponsor? You said she got a Democrat co-sponsor on the bill too.
She does. She has a Democrat co-sponsor, and she picked up another Republican co-sponsor in the interim. So
excellent.
Momentum is building on this, and it's interesting. This is a concrete example of how state and local action feeds into the surveillance state, because the federal government funds these drone programs. And it's interesting. The other day I was doing some research and I was looking at some websites of some of these companies that do. They sell drone technology, they sell Stingray technology, which I guess we're going to get into here in a minute, and other surveillance technologies. All of these websites have a page dedicated of how to get federal funding. This is how these state and local governments can afford this high-tech equipment. And in return, the federal government taps into these information databases that are created through what is called the Information Sharing Environment, or ISE. And so when you limit the collection of data at the state and local level, you're actually limiting the collection of data at the federal level. Because again, the federal government doesn't have this whole fleet of drones that they can fly all over the country. It depends on, the Corbin Police Department here in Kentucky, or the Los Angeles Police Department out there in California. They depend on them to do it, to get this information and then feed it into these giant databases where it effectively stays forever. So we can
Yeah, I
really,
think the
again,
important part on that is that I know a lot of people focus on the NSA, and certainly we do as well. But that is
right.
kind of the some of the big picture thing. The more granular local surveillance is always conducted by local law enforcement
Mhm.
agencies, sometimes state level law enforcement agencies, using devices like drones, for example, and then they feed that information up to Washington D.C. through, like you said, ISE information sharing environment or through fusion centers. And so this bill in Kentucky, House Bill 22, what was the vote on that? Do you know?
I think it was unanimous if I
Okay.
remember correctly. Yeah, it was either unanimous or there might have been one no. I think it was unanimous.
Okay, excellent. So a bill
Yep.
like that, although it isn't directly affecting surveillance in Washington, D.C. in a huge way, it's important also to deal with privacy and our rights on a local level, because if
Right.
they're the ones operating, we want to shut that down. But also the bonus effect in focusing on the local level and advancing liberty, protecting privacy on the local level, is it does also affect the federal government's ability to rely on these local communities to do their dirty work for them. So House Bill 22 in
Right.
Kentucky is a good positive step forward dealing with surveillance. A similar bill has been filed in Washington State for a couple of years. I know Matt Shea and Dave Taylor have a bill that also deals with drones. It's House Bill 1102. Is there anything significantly different that we should know about that one, Mike?
It's interesting the way they define drones, because they never actually say drone.
Right.
But when you look at the definitions in the bill, it's clearly meant for unmanned aircraft. I really like the definitions that they use because it actually lays out all of the things that they're not allowed to do with drones, and it includes facial recognition and some of these other technologies. Because really, a drone can be a platform of not only video and audio, but also, like I said, facial recognition. Some of them actually can do things where they like do odor detection, and the technology is amazing, and the
Yeah, they
drone
can
is a great
monitor
platform.
people's gait, the way that they walk. So depending on how,
Yep.
so a drone can be used for all kinds of different things. It can be used for listening, because as Edward Snowden just released a few days ago, some documents, or at least it was reported on that I saw, the federal government, the NSA, has this amazing voice recognition capability. So
Yep.
a drone picking up conversations, a tiny drone, could actually feed information back to NSA. They can have facial recognition, as you mentioned. They can watch your gait. This is really, really powerful stuff to be able to put a small device, remote controlled, and monitor people's behaviors.
Yeah, absolutely. And Washington is another place where the big hangup is getting it out of committee.
Yeah.
I think it would get some support if they could just get it out of the committee. So if you happen to live in Washington, we would highly encourage you to contact those committee members. We'll link to the report on our show notes page, and you can contact those folks and urge them to hold a hearing and vote on this
It's
very important
House
legislation.
Bill 1102. And then more on surveillance, too. Again, the same way you described it about how the local law enforcement agencies are getting funding, either just direct cash grants from Washington, D.C. to buy the gear, or sometimes the FBI or Department of Justice will just provide the gear directly. Another issue is automated license plate readers. This is a program, these things on the freeway, sometimes they put them on top of a cop car where it can read, I think, up to thousands of license plates per minute, and then they're actually tracking the location of those license plates. So all these red light cameras, like fast track cameras on the freeways, all these things all over the place are looking at where you are in your vehicle based on your license plate. And Mike, we've reported on this a few times. Give us a quick overview of how that information is ending up and how it's being used in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, this is one we actually have concrete evidence of this state, local, federal cooperation to create a massive database. And this is a DEA database that stores massive amounts of license plate data that's gathered at the state and local level. And they can actually use this to put together plots of where you've been. And when you really think about it, I've heard people talk about that are really involved in this privacy issue. And they'll tell you that you can actually find out more about a person by tracking their location and their habits and their patterns than you can at reading emails and whatnot. You know that they go to a certain church every week, or a certain religious institution.
Or a gun show.
Or a gun show, or a political event, or they can find out that you have cancer, or there's just an amazing amount of information that can be gathered just in knowing where you've been. So
Right, because if the NSA is collecting with help of Facebook all the things that we post about, maybe
right.
they know that I had a great bowl of ramen the other day. Well, I may not have posted on Facebook a few of the other things that I did over the weekend, and maybe I didn't even have my phone with me. But if I was in a car, and that they knew the license plate. I don't own a car, but that's another story. But if I were in a vehicle that had a license plate registered to my name and I went places and left my phone behind, they could still track where that is, especially in a city where I live, like Los Angeles, where they really have cameras all over the place. But also on some of these lonely highways, they know where people are exiting. They may know that there's a gun show off of Highway 41, for example. And that gives them a lot of information on your personal viewpoints.
Yeah, and here's the danger of this kind of thing. A lot of people will look at that. Oh, they'll say, "Oh, I don't care. What difference does it make to me?" But I read a story, and I can't remember what state it was in. But this guy got busted because he was growing tomatoes, and the reason he got busted is they had set up a license plate reader at a grow shop, one of these places where they sold, the big grow lights and whatnot. And they assumed because he had made a couple of trips there that he was growing marijuana in his house. So they actually raided his house, put him under arrest. It was the whole SWAT team thing. And as it turns out, he had bought this stuff so that he could grow tomatoes. So
man, these people are nasty.
It's horrible. And so, you think that it doesn't apply to me, but you could be doing something completely innocent that could be easily misconstrued.
Only a spineless bootlicker says it doesn't apply to me. I don't care. Straight up.
Exactly.
Even if they're not using it against you right now, if you're too much of a wimp to do anything about it, then you're not who we're talking to anyway. So
Right.
have fun laughing at us standing up for liberty. We're going to keep doing it. So the bill that we're talking about that would address this license plate reader issue, there's a number in states around the country, but I wanted to mention New York Senate Bill 23.
Yeah, that's a bill that actually was introduced last year and will carry over into this legislative session. And it's a really solid license plate bill. And what we look for in these isn't so much, that they ban the use of license plate readers, because that's probably not going to happen in any state. But the important thing that we look at is how are they restricting the use and sharing of data? And reading through the provisions of this bill, it has very strong protections. The data cannot be shared for pretty much any reason outside of this very narrow investigative purpose. They're not allowed to sell the data to anybody else. So by restricting this data, it keeps it from ending up in the DEA database. It also requires data to be destroyed after a certain amount of time. So these are the kind of things we look at in these ALPR bills. And this New York bill is really solid in the way it protects and restricts the use and sharing of data.
Moving forward, again, that's Senate Bill 23 in New York State that we're keeping an eye on. We'll watch a number of other bills I know in Nebraska. I think it's LB 93 that's up for a third reading and vote sometime this week. But also, again, the same process. Another way that they spy on all of us is through stingray devices. And in general, the way this works is that they have these small boxes that they carry around either in a vehicle or a briefcase or something. And what this does is it spoofs cell phone towers. It tricks all the cell phones within range of that tower into connecting first to the Stingray device. Actually, it's a cell site simulator. Stingray is a brand. But the cell site simulator device scoops up all that information, all the conversations, all the texts, all the voice communication, plus the location tracking. This is another way they track you by location. And first connects to the Stingray, so then the police get the information. And again, Mike, this is the same situation. They collect the information through the Stingray, which is funded by Washington, D.C. So in return, they just send that all off, right?
Yep, absolutely. And I think this is probably the most intrusive of all of these technologies. A lot of people that are involved in the privacy world say that really there's no way to use the Stingray device within the constraints of the Fourth Amendment, because it locks on to every single electronic device that's in range. So it has no way to discriminate. It's not like a telephone where you can tap a certain number.
Yeah, this is general warrant.
It is
as simple as can be. It is basically saying if you own a phone and you're in this range, we have a general warrant to collect data on everybody, your location and all your communication. I've heard from some people on this specific thing, like, oh, well, if the NSA is collecting information anyways, why do you care about stingrays? Well, I guess if they didn't care about collecting the data from stingrays, they wouldn't be giving them to the local police all over the place. So they clearly want this to happen, and that means we want it to not happen.
Absolutely. And, this is the kind of thing everybody assumes. It's a given that if you're going to tap somebody's phone, you've got to get a warrant. And yet there are police departments all over the country right now that are using these Stingray devices with no oversight, no warrants. They're often in complete secrecy because the federal government requires the local and state law enforcement to sign non-disclosure agreements when they get these things. So they're often operating without anybody even knowing that, with no warrants. So, we're asking for just basic privacy protections when we're talking about warrant requirements for a Stingray. I don't even understand how this could ever be controversial.
As a humorous aside, living in Los Angeles, talking with people that I run into, I often get a lot of blank stares. But when I talk about stingrays, it makes sense because so many people here work in the movie industry and everyone knows what an NDA is, non-disclosure agreement. So as soon as I say, the Department of Justice is requiring local governments to sign an NDA, and they actually are willing to lose a court case rather than provide the information of how the stingray is being used or where it's getting funded. So the Department of Justice is really driving this, right, Mike?
Absolutely. And I think it's really interesting, like you said, that the fact that they have dismissed cases, let a bad guy, I guess they assume he was arrested. So they said he was a bad guy. Let him go rather than disclose anything to the defense about the Stingray device. That really tells you something nefarious is going on. When they're trying to hide stuff, that's when bad stuff is going on. I know this personally because, trying to dig into surveillance here in Lexington, Kentucky, I got my rear end sued,
right?
Just for asking about cameras. So the fact that they're trying to hide this stuff should send up a huge red flag. They always tell us when we're talking about surveillance, well, if you don't have anything to hide, you got nothing to fear. Well, I say that to the government.
Right.
If you don't have anything to hide, then quit doing these non-disclosure agreements, quit suing people who are trying to find out about surveillance technology, and come clean with what you're doing.
So a couple of the many bills that we are following on Stingray, just most recently filed in Missouri, is House Bill 2104 from Representative Keith Frederick. He's tried this bill a couple of times. Hopefully he can get that moving forward. And then in Mississippi, is it 696, I think? House Bill 696 from Steve Hopkins. There are a number of other states that have legislation to consider on this particular issue, and we're going to have to, because we're just about winding it down here. We're running out of time, Mike. We'll have to cover a little bit more. But in general, the same, whatever the device that they're using to spy on us, the process is generally the same on the local level. The federal government provides grant money or they provide equipment, spy gear. The local law enforcement spies on you very closely in various different ways using different tools, and they're collecting that information for Washington, D.C., whether it's for the ATF or the DEA or the NSA or the FBI. We don't always know. We certainly know with the ALPRs that it is for the DEA specifically, but they're all sharing the information with each other too. So this is just another way they're profiling what we stand for. And it's a real dangerous situation.
It really is. And again, it emphasizes the fact that you can have an impact on something. When we think about federal spying, it's easy to say, we can't really do anything about it. The NSA is too big, far away, and powerful. But you can have an impact right in your local community, right in your state, by limiting these types of surveillance, putting those restrictions on you, not only protecting privacy at home, you're limiting the federal surveillance state. And if we get this through all 50 states, it's going to at least hinder what they're doing at the federal level. And, any step towards more privacy, any step towards less federal involvement in our lives is a good step forward.
Well, it's just the beginning of the nullification season here in late January, so it's good to see a few bills on these issues already moving forward. I think we're kind of ahead of the game, especially with Michigan on the Fourth Amendment Protection Act and Kentucky moving on the anti-drone spying bill. But we'll be monitoring these and many other issues. I'm not sure what we're going to cover next week, but I wanted to thank you for tuning in to episode 23 after a long hiatus, and we'll see you here at 10th or Tuesday next week.